Module 2, Lesson 2, Past Methods of Population Control. Before we look at the present methods used to prevent population growth, let us look at the past to see how our forefathers dealt with this problem in their days. Because, make no mistake, this is an age-old problem. Population control has been practiced consciously or unconsciously throughout the ages, either to compensate for our inability to find and harness resources, or to solve the competition problem between groups for the available resources. Population control was practiced unconsciously throughout the world and across cultures through infanticide, ritual murder, human sacrifice, cannibalism, and headhunting. This is how our distant forefathers have limited the quantity of human life to ensure their survival in the face of limited resources and limited means of harnessing these resources. In time, our forebears started to do more than just limit the quantity of life to ensure their survival. They began limiting the quantity of human life to preserve the quality, which is the first law of civilization building. The time when human societies began controlling population growth consciously is the time when the grand civilizations started to appear. And in this effort, shamans or witch doctors have been crucial because they were the first to limit the quantity of human life to preserve the quality, and did so by deciding when to leave the old behind to die rather than carry them along, and when to kill babies who were not normal, healthy, or strong enough to be allowed to live. They have thus paired life at both ends, birth and death, to keep the tribe within the available resources. They did this, of course, forced by dire circumstances for their survival, and not necessarily as a proactive and conscious way to make life better, and certainly not with the aim of improving the genetic stock. And nevertheless, this is the humble origin of the first law of civilization building. The second law of civilization building, namely that you have to slow down population growth to remain within the technical ability of society to produce food and build infrastructure, was born at a time in our history when societies were already stratified into social classes and specialized, and a good proportion of the population depended on others for food production. It was born from the understanding that it is best to preempt famine and war by preventing the population from outgrowing resources, which invariably happens within 2 generations, because in a natural state of population growth, where fertility is unimpeded by social or chemical means, the population doubles every 20 years. To double the arable land and the infrastructure to keep pace with the doubling of the population at a time when everything was done by hand was not always possible, which is why slowing down population growth became absolutely necessary. Different cultures developed different methods and social laws and norms to prevent the population from outgrowing resources. Most cultures and societies devised laws to limit childbearing only to married couples, and to delay marriage so as to delay childbearing, and in this fashion constrain people socially from procreating at will. The institution of marriage, therefore, was created in part, if not in whole, for the purpose of controlling population growth. The institution of marriage, however, is perhaps the most benign form of population control. Most methods of population control would have been and have been brutal. Pre-Columbian civilizations used human ritual sacrifice of horrendous proportions to keep or bring the population back within the available resources, which is why their civilizations flourished. And in the process, they picked the weakest among them to sacrifice, therefore aiding the process of natural selection. They hid their intent behind God so that no man could challenge them. All human sacrifices were justified as offerings to the gods to either incur divine favor or avoid divine retribution. But the reality is that pre-Columbian civilizations practiced population control through mass murder. Hindus relegated a good proportion of the population to untouchable status, thus the lowest social caste, to condemn them to extreme poverty and death as soon as famine struck, and in this fashion relieve material pressures on the rest of society. But they also forced widows to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre, so the rest of the community would not have to care for them once their husbands died. Hindus, therefore, practiced population control through social exclusion and self-immolation. Islamic societies castrated huge numbers of men and stuck women in harems to be guarded by eunuchs and remain childless and sex-starved for the remainder of their lives. Islam also turned society into a cloister for women by restricting their movement and covering their bodies at all times so as not to entice men. Islam, therefore, practiced population control through the castration of males and the isolation of females. Christian societies conceived the most elaborate and sophisticated methods of controlling population growth. The institutions of marriage and monasticism and the practice of witch burning by the Inquisition were methods of social engineering used to slow down population growth and to balance the number of men and women in society, which was particularly important in a society where women could not own property and monogamy was enshrined in law. But these were not always enough to halt population growth. It only slowed it down. And every second generation or so, famine and war ensued, trapping humanity in a vicious cycle. To escape this vicious cycle, a way had to be found to get ahead of the curve demographically, and biological warfare was added to the arsenal of population control methods, which is why the bubonic plague was spread every 40 to 60 years to trim back the population by a third and thus bring it back within resources. The problem with war is that it kills only males, and then you are left with an excess of females that would have to somehow be cared for outside the institution of marriage, since there were not enough husbands to go around in the aftermath of war. Pestilence kills both sexes in equal measure and spares the infrastructure. Moreover, it costs nothing. It is therefore a much cheaper and more effective way to combat population growth. It is also a great way to concentrate land, property, and wealth into fewer hands and thus suddenly raise the standard of living. Every strategy of population control has always been hidden behind God, and this is the case across cultures and not just for Christians. Take the institution of monasticism, for instance. By persuading a large proportion of the population that celibacy is a necessary precondition of service to God, and far more desirable than marriage, family life, and childbearing, and by enshrining the desirability of abstinence, obedience, humility, and poverty in canon law, the Church found a rather elegant way to prevent millions of men and women from making use of their reproductive organs and from exercising their God-given reproductive rights, thus effectively suppressing population growth to a significant degree. The institution of marriage, too, was created to limit childbearing to married couples only, and any children born out of wedlock were considered an offense to God, and more often than not, drowned shortly after birth. And the burning of women and heretics by the Inquisition was also justified as divine punishment for offenses committed against God. All other cultures also hid their population control methods behind God. Why they did this is rather obvious. Men, however weak, can challenge other men, however strong. But no man can challenge God. If it is God's will, it cannot be challenged. It can only be obeyed. That is why the laws of civilization building and the genocide and crimes against humanity they imply have always been hidden behind God. This too has its roots in shamanism. Shamans, or witch doctors, used their privileged positions and their purported ability to communicate with spirits to alleviate unrest and settle difficult issues in the community that could not be settled through consensus or through the authority of the chieftain. And that is why a shaman's decision, which was made after conferring with the spirits or the gods, could not be challenged by anyone and could only be obeyed blindly. The blind obedience demanded by religious leaders has always been rooted in the need to hide their role in controlling population growth and not just the behavior of people. When the profession of the shaman split into that of priests and doctors, the authority to settle disputes through the intercession of divine forces passed onto the priest. From that moment on, the oracle, who was a high priest, did what the shaman did in the past. Decisions that would send countless people to war or to their death, so the balance between people and resources could be restored, became the purview of the high priest. To this day, and across cultures, the parameters for population control are set by the high priests, thus by religious leaders, while the methodology of population control is devised and applied by doctors. And political leaders give them the legal and political cover they need to get away with crimes against humanity and genocide. And the paradox is that this is done for benevolent reasons, because someone has to play God in human societies and keep life and death in balance, just as God does in nature. Society is, after all, an artificial construct entirely of man's making, and therefore entirely out of God's hands. And if someone does not take up this role, societies invariably collapse. What we learn from looking at the past is that to advance our civilization, we must make the leap forward from involuntary sacrifice to voluntary self-sacrifice. Until now, we have been sacrificed by our leaders. From now on, we must sacrifice for mankind and for the sanctity of life.